This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a special video, my guide to the limited archetypes of adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Throughout the week I've been doing my set review for this brand new format, giving my thoughts on every single card in the set, and as usual, this archetype guide wraps up the review with a look at the various synergies that exist in each two-color combination in the format. This is not a video where I'm going to talk about the individual cards that are the best to play in this format unless those cards happen to have some special synergy within one of these color pairs. Alright, let's get started with our first color pair, which is black-white. I thought it would be good to start out with the color pairs that are about these dungeons because that's one of the really unique and interesting things about this format, and one of the more Dungeons and Dragons-y things about this format. So each color pair in this format has only one signpost in common. It's been a while since we've only had one. Our last few sets have had a lot of signposts, but this is actually more normal. Having 10 color pairs, 10 archetypes, and one signpost in common for each is sort of the traditional thing in Magic Limited. And black-white, as the name says here, is all about completing dungeons. You know, there are different things that you want to do with dungeons depending on your color pair. Black-white is the most interested in completing them, and that's something that Barrowin of Clan Undur tells you here. She ventures into the dungeon, which is good. You know, that's what this color pair wants to be doing, but she also has an extra bonus if you've completed a dungeon, which is that you're able to reanimate a creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield if you've completed that dungeon. And that means if you're in black-white, the dungeons you're probably the most interested in completing are either the Lost Mine of Phandelver or the Tomb of Annihilation. They can both be completed really quickly, unlike Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which, as we'll see, is more what the blue-white deck is probably interested in doing. Dungeon of the Mad Mage has a way more powerful payoff than the other two, but the other two are capable of being completed very, very quickly. You can even complete the Tomb of Annihilation in 3 steps, though you have to go through Oubliette, which is a really, really bad effect for you. But if you have enough cards that say if you've completed a dungeon, it may turn out that it's worth it. It'll be interesting to see if that's the case. The Lost Mine of Phandelver you can do in 4 ventures, and when you venture, by the way, you just go into the first room of one of these dungeons. You can pick any of them. They're not cards you have to draft. They're just cards that exist outside of the game. And you start in the first room, and then every time you venture thereafter, you move into another room. So black-white is all about completing dungeons quickly. It has a lot of payoffs for completing them, and that means you're not really going to be interested in the Dungeon of the Mad Mage in this color pair because you're not going to need amazing payoffs to be on the dungeons themselves. You're going to have cards that have big payoff abilities for completing dungeons. So let's look at some of these dungeon payoffs at common and uncommon. Obviously, there is Barrowin, who is a payoff for you, and also ventures, which is great. There's also Cloister Gargoyle, another card that ventures when it ETBs, and then also gets +3/+0 in flying if you've completed a dungeon. Gloomstalker does not venture on his own, but he does become a double striker if you've completed a dungeon. Dungeon Crawler comes back from your graveyard to your hand when you complete a dungeon. It's a little interesting in that, unlike the other ones, you have to have this in a certain place when the dungeon is completed to get the bonus. The others don't care when the dungeon was completed to give you something, but Dungeon Crawler does. Precipitous Drop is a removal spell that triggers when you venture into the dungeon, and then if you've completed a dungeon, it becomes more potent. Alright, let's look now at cards that venture in black-white. We've got something like Delver's Torch, which is a little bit clunky of a piece of equipment, but it does let you venture every time you attack with the equipped creature. There's also Planar Ally, which on its own ventures every time it attacks, which is great because it's a 5-mana 3/3 flyer as a baseline. There's also Veteran Dungeoneer, which ventures when it enters the battlefield, Clattering Skeletons, which ventures when it dies, and Zombie Ogre, which ventures at the end of your turn if you had a creature die this turn. There's also some artifacts like Dungeon Map, which can venture for you, and 50 Feet of Rope. There's also Yuan Ti Feng Blade, which when it hits the opponent ventures, and Fate's Reversal, which lets you return a creature to your hand and venture. There's also Ranger's Hawk, which lets you venture, but it does have a significant cost in that you have to tap it and another creature you control to get the venture to happen, and you have to do it at sorcery speed, which is kind of a bummer. Alright, so the rares for this color pair include Nadar's Selfless Paladin, a creature who likes it when dungeons are completed because he gives you a Anthem effect for your whole board, and he's also really efficient, and when he attacks or enters the battlefield, you get to venture, so he can venture quickly. There's also Acerarach, the Archlich. He's interesting in that he wants a specific dungeon to be completed. It's the only card that really cares about one specific dungeon, and it wants that really hard one, the Tomb of Annihilation, the one that's going to be difficult to complete in terms of using up your resources, but you can complete it in 3 steps if you want to. And if you haven't completed that one, all Acererak will do for you is venture, and you can choose another dungeon if you really want to with Acererak, because maybe there's some reason you're already deep in a dungeon and you want to go that route. But he won't ever stay in play unless you complete the Tomb of Annihilation. And then once he's a creature, he's kind of crazy because he makes a 2/2 black zombie creature token anytime it attacks, unless your opponent sacks a creature. It's also sort of a signpost rare and triumphant adventurer, a creature with death touch that has first strike when it attacks, that also ventures every time it attacks. So that's black-white. It's about quickly completing dungeons as opposed to grinding through dungeons for value. Meanwhile, that's what blue-white's about. It's about grinding through dungeons for value, and Hama Pashar, Ruin Seeker, the signpost here, tells you that. She says room abilities of dungeons you own trigger in additional time. So that means you want to be venturing as much as possible. You don't care as much in this color pair about actually completing dungeons. You just want to grind through dungeons and get a bunch of value, and that means you probably want the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which has progressively more powerful effects, way more powerful than anything the Lost Mine of Phandelver or the Tomb of Annihilation do, until at the very end you get to the Mad Wizard's Lair and you get the absurd effect of drawing 3 cards and revealing them, and you can cast one of them without paying its mana cost. Obviously, if you have Hama Pashar in play, that'll be even more absurd, but the point is, you really want Dungeon of the Mad Mage if you're in blue-white in most cases. So what are the dungeon payoffs here? Well, we do still have access to Gloomstalker and Cloister Gargoyle, but you don't have access to any of the black dungeon completion payoffs, but there is one in blue, one dungeon completion payoff, and that is Eccentric Apprentice, which is a really strong card in general, one of the better uncommons in the set. Ventures when it comes down, and then if you have completed a dungeon, it lets you start turning a creature on the board into a bird every turn, which can be pretty nice. But as you can see, not nearly as many payoffs for completing dungeons, and you're also less likely to be completing them because Dungeon of the Mad Mage will be so much better for you in this deck. So Gloomstalker and Cloister Gargoyle probably not at their best in this deck, but, they'll still be fine here. Just not as good as they would be in black-white. So let's look at venturing here. You have a lot of the same cards in white, obviously, like Delver's Torch, Planar Ally, Veteran Dungeoneer. You also have access to artifacts like Dungeon Map. There's also other cards, though, like Secret Door, which is, sort of a grindier, more controlling venture effect because it's on a 1-mana 0/4 with an expensive ability. You've got Fly, which is pretty cool because it gives a creature flying and gives it the ability to venture every time you hit the opponent with it. Displacer Beast, another sort of grindy way to venture because you can just keep returning it to your hand and playing it again. Bar the Gate, counterspell that ventures for you, which is very blue-white. So what are the rares here? Well, you still have Nadar, Selfless Paladin, but there's also Yuan-Ti Malison, who is unblockable when it attacks alone, and every time it hits your opponent, you get to venture. So those are the 2 most dungeon-y color pairs. Every color pair will have some dungeon stuff going on, but these are the 2 that really have the most payoffs for it. Let's move now to blue-black, which is all about Evasion and Saboteur Triggers. A Saboteur Trigger, that's the name that Wizards R&D uses, when they're testing a set or designing cards, and it means it's an effect that says whenever you deal combat damage to an opponent. And that's what this color pair is all about, making creatures with those kinds of triggers evasive and hitting your opponent with them. And Kreidel really shows you that. He may be the best of these signpost uncommons because he's pretty insane. He's a 2-mana 1/3. When he hits the opponent, you get 1 life, you mill a card, and you gain 1 life, and you scry 1. And then whenever you attack, you can pay 2, and if you do, target creature can't be blocked this turn. Now, you can only make 1 creature unblockable per turn, but it is notable. Kreidel doesn't have to attack, but he also can, and he can target himself to use that ability, and that's not too shabby of an ability. It will end games more quickly than it looks. Your opponent will be losing 2 every turn, you'll be gaining 1 every turn, you'll be improving your draws, and that's pretty awesome. But he's good all game long because he can just make whatever unblockable for only 2 mana. So let's look first at Saboteur Triggers at common and uncommon here. So we've got Kreidel, of course. It's also Guild Thief, a creature that when it hits your opponent gets a counter. It can also make itself unblockable, but it's rather expensive. It also starts out rather fragile, but it is what this deck's about. Soul Knife Spy, nice reasonably efficient creature that lets you draw a card when it hits the opponent. Trickster's Talisman, an equipment that if your creature who's equipped hits the opponent, you can choose to sack the talisman and make a copy of that creature. Fly, which we've already seen, gives a creature evasion and also gives it a Saboteur trigger, which, again, really what this deck is about. Shortcut Seeker ventures every time it hits the opponent. Horde Robber makes treasure anytime it hits the opponent. Drider makes a 2/1 black spider creature token with menace and reach anytime it hits the opponent. And Yuan-Ti Fangblade ventures when it hits the opponent. So how do we go about triggering Saboteur in this deck? Obviously, Krydle gets us there, but are there other ways? And the answer is yes. So you have access to You Come to a River, which can be used two different ways to help you get a Saboteur trigger. One of them is that you can return an on-land permanent, maybe a blocker, to its owner's hand. And the other is that you can give +1/+0 and unblockable to a creature. So if it's one of these creatures with a Saboteur trigger, that might be pretty appealing. There's also Air Cult Elemental, which does not really directly help you trigger Saboteur, but this color pair has access to a lot of like cheap removal or incidental bounce effects that will work well with you trying to trigger these abilities. And Air Cult Elemental is one of those that lets you bounce a creature, which could be a blocker that lets your Saboteur creatures get in. There's Fly, which we've already seen, both grants evasion and enables another Saboteur trigger. Putting this on a creature that already has one will be pretty sweet. There's also cards like Scion of Stygia, which can tap things down sometimes for more than one turn. That gets a blocker out of the way for you. There's, of course, Krydle. Ray of Frost, another spell that helps get a blocker out of the way, though only if it's red will it tap the creature. A Baleful Beholder gives menace to your whole team, which is pretty sweet in terms of triggering Saboteur effects. Power of Persuasion is another bounce spell. Reaper's Talisman gives your creature Death Touch, and that's going to make it a lot harder for your opponent to block. Thieves' Tools makes small creatures unblockable, in addition to giving you treasure, and most of the creatures with Saboteur triggers are small enough that you can put this on it and make it unblockable. You've also got Split the Party, which allows you to bounce some stuff, and sometimes will enable you to hit your opponent. So what are the rares that are useful in this color pair? Well, there's of course Rogue class, which is really all about enabling these things. It gives your creatures a new Saboteur trigger. All of them get a new Saboteur trigger, which exiles the top card of your opponent's library when they hit them. They can also gain Menace if you pump mana into level 2, which will also be good with all these triggers. And then at level 3, you can start playing cards that you exiled with the level 1 effect, and that's pretty awesome. There's Vorpal Sword, another card that grants Death Touch, so that's kind of nice for making a creature pseudo-evasive. And it also can enable a really insane Saboteur ability. If you have 8 mana around, you can use it, and it'll win you the game when you hit your opponent. And you have enough things that are unblockable in this color pair that could be a problem. There's also Grazilax Illithid Scholar, which makes your attacks a lot less risky, because when you attack with stuff, if it gets blocked, you can return it to your hand. And also adds a really powerful Saboteur trigger, lets you draw a card when one or more of your creatures deals combat damage to a player. It's not exactly a Saboteur trigger in the sense that you only get to draw one no matter how many of your creatures hit your opponent, so keep that in mind, but it is another effect that fits well here. And there's also Emerith, Desert Doom. It's a bomb, it's going to be good in any deck, but it does have a Saboteur trigger. And we've also seen Yuan-Ti Malison already. So that's blue-black. It's about Saboteur effects and evasion on small creatures. Let's move now to blue-red, another very Dungeons & Dragons-y color pair, and doing something we've never seen before in Magic. And that is that it's all about rolling dice. And Faraday, Devil's Chosen here, shows you that. It's a 4-mana 3/3 that anytime you roll one or more dice, gains Flying and Menace. So really hard to block. And if you roll a 10 or higher, you get to draw a card. So you really want to be rolling dice if you're in blue-red, because enabling something like Faraday is absolutely insane. So what are the payoffs here? Well, there's Faraday, of course. There's also Firewild Trickster, which is a powerful payoff that can give you flying creature tokens. There's also Pixie Guide, which will increase your chances of rolling what you want to roll because it lets you roll more dice. There's Brazen Dwarf, which does 1 to the opponent anytime you roll 1 or more dice. There's Barbarian class, which has the same effect as the Pixie Guide at level 1, lets you roll multiple dice. Then at level 2, it gives you an insane dice rolling payoff, +2/+0 and Menace to a creature anytime you roll dice. And level 3 doesn't actually have anything to do with dice, but obviously the rest of the card does. Critical Hit, not a card I love. It's a pretty bad combat trick. But if you're rolling a lot of dice, and especially getting extra rolls off of cards like Pixie Guide and Barbarian class, you might get it back to your hand for free sometimes. All right, so what cards let you roll a d20? There's actually a lot of them in blue-red, so triggering these effects is going to be pretty easy. There's stuff like Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, which lets you roll a d20 when it comes into play. 1 through 9, you get to put an instant or sorcery on top of your library. 10 through 20, you return it to your hand. Arcane Investigator has an activated ability that rolls a d20. It lets you draw a card one way or another. You get more card selection if you have a higher roll. Contact Other Plane does various levels of being a draw spell depending on what you roll. Genie Windseer scries different amounts depending on what you roll. Power of Persuasion will either bounce a creature or time ebb it, or even let you gain control of it depending on what you roll. Scion of Stygia either tap something or tap something down for a turn if you have a higher die roll. Chaos Channeler exiles cards from the top of your library and lets you play them depending on what you roll. Earth Cult Elemental has various sacrifice effects depending on what you roll. Faraday's Fireball will either damage both you and your opponent or just your opponent when you cast it depending on what you roll. Goblin Morningstar will always give you a 1/1 goblin, but if you roll a higher roll, it will equip to it on its own. Swarming Goblins gives you more goblins depending on what you roll. And there's also one artifact at common or uncommon that does d20 stuff, and that's Spiked Pit Trap. But as you can see, there's a lot of commons and uncommons here that will really support cards like Faraday, so it looks pretty legit to me. So what are some rares here? Well, we've got Delina Wildmage, which has various die roll effects when she attacks. She copies creatures, makes temporary token copies of them that are attacking when she's attacking. And you just get to do that once if you roll 1 through 14, but if you roll 15 through 20, you get to do it and then roll again. So you're going to get at least 2 copies, and you do get to roll multiple times if you keep hitting 15 through 20. Wizard's Spellbook lets you do various things with an instant or sorcery in your graveyard, depending on what you roll. The Deck of Many Things is an artifact that has all kinds of powerful effects, depending on what you roll. And Treasure Chest is an artifact you sacrifice that has mostly powerful effects, depending on what you roll. Not if you roll 1 so much. So that's blue-red. It's about rolling dice and getting value out of that. Let's move to black-green now, where the main theme is Morbid. In other words, this is a keyword we've seen in the past. Morbid basically means you get some kind of bonus if a creature happened to die this turn. And that's what Shesra Death's Whisper is showing us here. She has one of these morbid effects in that at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you can pay 2 life, and if you do, you draw a card. She also has an effect that forces the opponent to block, which could help you enable that Whispers of the Grave effect. And keep in mind for these effects, it doesn't matter how the creature died or which side of the board it died on. You get this effect one way or another, no matter, whose creature died or how it died. So what are some other morbid effects at common and uncommon? There's Shesra, of course. So it's a Death Priest of Mirkul, which if something has died during your turn, you can pay 1 generic, and if you do, you get a skeleton. It's also a skeleton, vampire, and zombie lord, which is nice. Grim Wanderer can only be cast if a creature died this turn, which is sometimes going to be tricky to fulfill, but when you can, you get a really efficient creature. Warlock class also has a morbid effect. At level 1, if a creature died during your turn on your instep, your opponent loses 1 life. Zombie Ogre we've seen already. It has a venture thing that happens if a creature has died during your turn. Boulette gains a +1/+1 counter if a creature died during your turn. And Purple Worm gets discounted down to 5 mana if a creature has died this turn. So how do we go about triggering Morbid? Well, it's going to happen naturally to some extent just in combat and stuff, and also using removal spells will trigger it. But there's some other more creative ways you can trigger it too. For example, you could have Skullport Merchant who can sacrifice creatures to draw you cards, and that fits in well here. You could have Sepulchre Ghoul, which gains stats if you sacrifice things to it. You can only sacrifice 1 thing to it a turn, but luckily, that's all Morbid cares about is 1 thing. Deadly Dispute gives you a way to give up creatures or treasure or artifacts, more generally, to draw 2 cards. Neverwinter Dryad can sacrifice itself. So here's an interesting thing. You have Tomb of Annihilation, right, which the oubliette part looks pretty rough. But if you're in this color pair, Tomb of Annihilation might actually be an appealing route to take. Even if you don't go the oubliette route, the Sandfall Cell route will still allow you to sacrifice a creature and turn on Morbid, and that could be interesting. Mimic is another kind of weird way you can trigger it because you can animate it and then sack it for treasure, at which point, you lost a creature that turn. So what are the rares for this color pair? Well, 2 of them are just, all 3 of them really, are just going to be really good in any deck. But Lolth, especially Lolth and Ebon Death, they're just great cards, but they do both care about things dying. Lolth gains loyalty counters when stuff dies. Ebon Death can only be cast if something not named Ebon Death has died on a given turn. And Skeletal Swarming is more of sort of a signpost rare, I suppose. It gives you a skeleton every single turn. And if something has died during your turn, you get 2 skeletons instead of just 1. So that's black-green. It's about finding value out of creatures dying, something that it often does. Let's move now to Black-Red, which is all about treasure, and that's something that Kalain Reclusive Painter is showing you here. When she comes down, she makes a treasure, and then she has text that says, other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast them. And there's a bunch of cards like that in this set in Black-Red that say if mana from a treasure was spent on this, you get some bonus. And Kalain is showing you that. She's pretty amazing because just on her own, she'll give you a 1/2. And then like next turn, you can sack the treasure and have a bigger creature that you ramped into. Another bonus about being a treasure deck is that this is the color pair that will pretty effortlessly be able to splash stuff. Like if you just have a few cards that make treasure like Kalain, it's going to be hard not to splash stuff. Why wouldn't you? Because you have access to all the mana, and that's pretty sweet. So what are the treasure payoffs here other than Kalain? I mean, we do have Kalain, of course. It's also Deadly Dispute, which doesn't say something about treasure specifically other than the fact that it makes it. But sacking treasure to Deadly Dispute is going to feel especially good because sometimes you have treasure you just don't need. And if you can sacrifice it to something like Deadly Dispute, you're not giving up a real card and you still draw 2 cards and get a treasure back. So you're not really giving much up if you sack a treasure to Deadly Dispute. There's Devour Intellect, which if you don't pay treasure mana for, is kind of a mediocre discard spell. But if you do pay treasure mana for it, well, it's pretty amazing. It becomes like a better Inquisition of Kozilek type effect. Hired Hexblade ends up drawing you a card and you lose 1 life if you spent treasure mana on it. Skullport Merchant is here again. He makes a treasure when he comes down. In addition to being able to sack creatures, he can also sack treasure. Jaded Sellsword gains haste and first strike if you spend treasure on it. Price of Loyalty becomes more potent. It gives the creature you steal +2/+0 if you spend treasure on it. And I do want to say that I think Price of Loyalty is actually going to be pretty legitimate in this deck. If you just look at the cards we've looked at here, Deadly Dispute and Skullport Merchant both allow you to sacrifice a creature. So you could steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it. And that's what can make that kind of effect powerful. And there are actually other ways in the color pair to do it too that we're not necessarily going to talk about here. So Price of Loyalty seems pretty legit in this color pair. This will certainly be the best place for it. Rust Monster, another card that doesn't say treasure outright, but it can eat artifacts to get bigger, and it's got first strike, so it's very difficult for your opponent to block. So how do you make treasure in this color pair? Well, you've got some nice removal spells that just happen to make you treasure, like Grim Bounty. You've got Herald of Hadar, which has an expensive mana sink ability that gives you treasure, but only if you roll a 20. You've got Horde Robber, who if it does damage to the opponent makes a treasure. You've got Improvised Weaponry, a decent removal spell that comes with treasure. Thieves' Tools is here again. It not only makes a small creature unblockable, it also gives you a treasure token when it comes into play. Plundering Barbarian can either destroy an artifact or make a treasure token. Unexpected Windfall lets you rummage through your deck a little bit while also making treasure. Spiked Pit Trap can make treasure if you roll a 10 through 20. Dungeon of the Mad Mage can actually make treasure, so if you are venturing with this color pair, I mean, every color pair will venture, but some won't be as interested in it, and this is one that's not super interested. Red is the color with the least amount of venturing, so, not going to be easy to complete dungeons. However, getting treasure tokens for this deck, like with Goblin Bazaar here, will be pretty good. Lost Mine of Fendelver may just be even better because you can get the treasure sooner, and you may actually get to complete the dungeon because it's so easy to complete. But keep in mind, these can make treasure for you, so any card you have with Venture sort of kind of helps you make treasure. Shambling Ghast, when it dies, can either give something -1/-1 until end of turn or make a treasure. There's also Mimic, which we saw earlier. It is a treasure. It's also can become a creature. What are the rares for this color pair? Well, you've got Treasure Chest, which, if you're going to be rolling multiple dice and getting bonuses for rolling dice, Treasure Chest is going to feel good. Treasure Vault is a land that can make a bunch of treasure. And Zorn doubles the amount of treasure you make. Not quite doubles, but if you're making 1 treasure, gives you a second one. If you're making 2, gives you a third one, etc. Gives you a bunch more treasure. So that's Black-Red. It's about treasure. Again, it's going to be a color pair that can splash a bunch of stuff, which is pretty sweet, on top of the fact that it has this cool treasure synergy. All right, let's move to Red-White now, where we're doing something we've seen Red-White do a lot of lately, and that is that it's an equipment aggro deck. Brunor Battlehammer is our signpost uncommon here. Starts with decent stats as a 4-mana 5/3, and then he gives your equipment 2 different bonuses. First, creatures who are equipped to get +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it, and you can pay 0 rather than pay the equip cost of the first equip ability you activate each turn. So that's pretty insane if you have equipment, and the good news is there's a lot of other decent or good equipment payoffs, and this format has a lot of solid equipment in it. It looks well supported here. So let's look at the other equipment payoffs first. To common and uncommon, we've got Brunor, of course. There's Armory Veteran, which gains Menace when it's equipped. Dwarfhold Champion, which gets +0/+2 when it's equipped. Ingenious Smith, which doesn't say the word equipment anywhere on it, but if you have enough artifacts in your deck, it can draw you a card, and anytime you play an artifact, which includes equipment, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Ingenious Smith. You've also got Plate Armor, which is both an equipment and an equipment payoff. It's a good equipment in general because of the boost that it gives for the cost, but its equip cost can be reduced even without Brunor because of the fact that you get to decrease it by 1 for each other equipment you control. So, those are the equipment payoffs. The Veteran and the Champion are both common, and I think that's pretty relevant. Both of them can get pretty scary with equipment, especially the Armory Veteran. So, what are the equipment here? Well, as I said, there's a bunch of solid equipment here. It includes Boots of Speed, which can grant +1/+0 and haste for a pretty low cost. It includes Dueling Rapier, which can be equipped at instant speed. It's got flash. The turn you play it equips for free. It does have an expensive equip cost, but that first time you equip it will feel pretty good. We've seen Goblin Morningstar already. It gives a reasonable boost for the cost and some goblins, or a goblin. Delver's Torch, which gives an okay stats boost, but also happens to allow you to venture. You've also got +2 Mace, which gives a creature a decent boost, not super efficiently. Paladin Shield isn't one I love. It's a purely defensive equipment for the most part. And, it does equip at instant speed, though, which could matter. Another flash equipment that equips for free. And then there's Plate Armor, which I think is sort of the key here. I think it's the most powerful of all of these common and uncommon equipments. Goblin Morningstar gets close to. The two of those are quite good. And those are just the colored equipments. You've also got access to Leather Armor, which I don't love, but if you have enough equipment payoffs, maybe it's worth it. Spare Dagger, kind of the same thing. Don't love it, but if you have enough equipment payoffs, could get interesting. Great Axe, if you have a few ways to reduce the cost of equipment, like Brunor, Great Axe suddenly becomes pretty interesting. If you don't have ways to reduce that equip cost, it's pretty rough. So what are the rares for Red-White? Well, there's Fighter Class, which is all about equipment. The first level lets you tutor one up. The second level decreases equip costs. And the third level doesn't actually do anything with equipment, but it does help you attack. Dancing Sword is a powerful, efficient equipment that can turn into a creature when it needs to. Icing Death going to be good everywhere, but, he does make an equipment when he dies, so he's here. And there's also Hand of Vecna, an equipment that can grant some pretty big boosts if you have cards in your hand. So that's Red-White. It's an aggro deck. It also likes to use equipment. Worth noting, this color pair also has lots of creatures with keyword abilities like Lifelink and First Strike that will be equipped quite well. So that's another bonus of this sort of equipment deck. Next up, let's look at Blue-Green, which, like Red-White, is doing something we've seen it do a whole lot of lately, and that's ramp. And Gretchen Titchwillow tells us that. She's a nice defensive creature who has a nice activated ability that lets you draw a card, and then you can put a land onto the battlefield tapped. So it's all about ramp. It's all about drawing cards, usual Blue-Green stuff. It's going to feel not too dissimilar from what we just saw in Strixhaven with, Gretchen Titchwillow and other cards like it. So how does this color pair ramp? Well, obviously, there's Gretchen Titchwillow who can help you do that. There's also Clever Conjurer who can untap permanents not named Clever Conjurer, and this will include your lands. Once again, we have access to dungeons here that can help you ramp. Lost Mines of Findelver makes treasure, as does Dungeon of the Mad Mage. There's Druid Class, which gains you life when lands come into play. That doesn't help you ramp exactly, but it is a payoff for ramping. And level 2 lets you play additional lands on your turn. And then level 3, the more lands you have in play, the better, because it makes a larger creature. Find the Path is pretty sweet because it both ventures and helps you ramp. Also combos really well with that Clever Conjurer, because if you're untapping a land that has this on it, you're going to be getting a ton of mana. Neverwinter Dryad, we've seen already. You can sack it for a forest. Prosperous Innkeeper gives you a treasure when it comes into play. Scaled Herbalist in the early game can help you ramp by letting you play extra lands. You Happen on a Glade isn't exactly ramp, but it does make sure you're going to hit your land drops because you can just search up basic lands with it. It can also help you splash. You Find a Cursed Idol is a nice modal card that can blow up problem artifacts or enchantments, but if it can't do that, you can also make a treasure and venture into the dungeon. So, fair bit of ramp here at common and uncommon. What kind of things can you ramp into? Well, there's some big dragons, of course. This is a Dungeons & Dragons set. You've got access to Blue Dragon, for example, a 7-mana 5/5 with a powerful Into the Battlefield ability that really weakens your opponent's board for a whole turn cycle. Sudden Insight is a nice draw spell that is expensive, but if you have enough cards in your graveyard, it can be pretty sweet. Displacer Beast is the kind of thing that just has a mana sink ability because you can just keep playing it and venturing. Arcane Investigator has an expensive ability, but in the late game can be quite powerful, and it's the kind of mana sink that this deck is interested in. You've got Green Dragon in addition to Blue Dragon, who, when it comes down, makes it so if any of your opponent's creatures are dealt damage that turn, they're destroyed. Hill Giant Herd Gorger, just a big dude who gains you some life. Loathsome Troll has a mana sink ability from the graveyard that you can sink some mana into. So what rares are well suited for this color pair? Well, there's Circle of Dreams Druid. It's a little tricky, costing triple green, but obviously it can give you tons of mana when you do play it. Long Rest, another kind of tricky spell because it's only good really late, but if you have a lot of mana, it can be insane. Old Gnawbone is a big thing you can ramp into that also gives you even more mana in the form of treasure. The Tarask, this is going to be the best deck for it, pretty much. It's very hard to cast. If you can, you probably win. And this deck will have access to the most mana and will most easily be able to produce triple green. The Black-Red deck may be able to get to 9 mana, but even it with its treasure might have a challenging time producing triple green. Ochre Jelly, an X creature that gets better the more mana you can pump into it, so obviously it's well suited here. So that's blue-green. It's about ramp. Let's move now to green-white, which is a Lifegain color pair this time around. Trelasara shows us that. She's a 2-mana 2/2, and anytime you gain life, she gets a counter, and you scry 1. Pretty nice payoff for gaining life. So what are the life payoffs at common and uncommon? Well, we've got Trelasara. There's also Celestial Unicorn, who gains a counter when you gain life. There is Cleric class, which is a very powerful life gain payoff. If you have it in this deck, it's going to be quite good. At first, it just gains you extra life, but at level 2, you start putting counters places when you gain life. And then at level 3, you get to reanimate something and gain a bunch of life. Steadfast Paladin has lifelink, so it's a potentially repeatable source of life gain for Trelasara in the Unicorn and Cleric class. Lurking Roper is a really sweet card because it's just got amazing stats as a baseline, but it doesn't untap normally. The only way it untaps is if you gain life. So here, you're seeing that the payoffs aren't all over the place. You do have the Unicorn at common, which is nice. The Paladin, by the way, not actually payoff and shouldn't be here. It does help you gain life, though. You've really only got the Unicorn, the Cleric class, the Lurking Roper, and Trelasara, which is not a ton. So this color pair may sometimes just be sort of a traditional aggressive deck with a life gain sub-theme. Sometimes it will really come together, especially if you get some rares. But as you can see, there's not an insane amount of support for it. Let's talk about the ways you can gain life at common and uncommon. Well, you've got Dawnbringer Cleric, who also can flexibly destroy enchantments or exile cards from the graveyard. You've got Priest of Ancient Lore, which is just a nice card that draws you a card anyway, but it also gains you that 1 life. You've got Potion of Healing, which can gain you life. You've got the Paladin, who does belong here, which can gain you life. Inspiring Bard, one of its options, can gain you life. Prosperous Innkeeper is going to be a really nice repeatable source of life gain for those cards that care every time you gain life, because anytime a creature enters the battlefield, you get to gain 1 life. Sylvan Shepherd gains you life every time it attacks. How much depends on what you roll. You also have Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which its first level can gain you a life, so sometimes that's going to be where you want to go if you venture. And you also have Lost Mines of Phandelver, which doesn't gain you life till the 3rd level at the Dark Pool. There's also Hill Giant Herd Gorger, who we've already seen, who can gain you some life. So there are some rares well suited here. Eye of Vecna will be nice because if you're good at gaining life, you're not going to be afraid to pay it. The Book of Exalted Deeds kind of looks like a tall order to me. As we've seen, there aren't that many ways to gain 3 or more life in a turn with a single card. You're going to have to string life gain together, and that's just not going to be that easy. So this color pair sort of seems undersupported overall compared to most of the rest of the color pairs we've seen. Mostly, it may just be, as I said, a green-white aggro deck with a life gain sub-theme as opposed to a green-white life gain deck all the time. Now, let's move to red-green, which is also an aggressive deck, but it's built around a specific mechanic called Pack Tactics. And basically, Pack Tactics, as you can see on Targnar here, it means that anytime you attack with creatures with total power 6 or greater, you get some kind of effect. And in Targnar's case, your whole board gets +1/+0. And I think Targnar is hinting at sort of a secondary theme for this color pair too, which is going wide, which makes sense. That's going to help you get Pack Tactics, but also, he likes it if you're going wide because he pumps the whole board. He also comes with the ability to pump his own power and toughness until end of turn, which, if you can double that up, will be crazy. Sometimes he'll be able to get Pack Tactics all on his own, though that's not that exciting because, again, kind of wants you to go wide. So let's look at the other cards with Pack Tactics. We've got Targnar. We've got Battlecry Goblin, which when it attacks and you trigger Pack Tactics, you get a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. The Battlecry Goblin is also just a goblin payoff in general. There's a decent number of them in this set, and it can pump goblin power and give them haste. So that combos well as well, including it can pump itself. it can also help you get to pack tactics because it can pump its own power. Hobgoblin Captain gets you halfway to pack tactics all on its own and gains first strike when you do get there, and that's a pretty scary thing to have on a 2-drop. Tiger Tribe Hunter, if you reach pack tactics, lets you sacrifice a creature, and you can do damage equal to that creature's power to another target creature. Null Hunter gets a +1/+1 counter when pack tactics is triggered. Intrepid Outlander ventures when pack tactics is triggered. So those are sort of the pack tactics payoffs, and definitely the Captain and the Null Hunter are going to be some pretty high quality commons, I think, for this deck. They're going to be able to get big in a hurry in this deck, or harder to block in a hurry. In the case of the Captain, looks pretty sweet overall to me. How do you go about triggering this? Well, obviously, it's just going to happen sometimes, but there are a few little ways here and there that you can trigger it more easily. Some of them involve like only one creature, like Earth Cult Elemental being able to do it all on its own. Valor Singer adds, a lot of power to the battlefield, including his own and the +1/+0, which can help you get to pack tactics, and he doesn't even have to attack if you don't want him to. You've also got things like You See a Pair of Goblins, which plays well into the go wide theme here because it can make you goblin tokens, but also plays well into the go wide theme because you can pump your whole board with it, which will almost certainly allow you to trigger pack tactics. And these mass pump spells, if you have 2 or 3 things in play with pack tactics and they all trigger, it's going to be pretty silly. Choose Your Weapon can let you double one creature's power. Sometimes you'll want to do it. Circle of Moon Druid, when it attacks, when it's your turn, it's a 4/2. So that's a pretty cheap creature that gets you pretty close, 2/3 of the way to pack tactics on its own. Eltugard Ranger on its own can give you pack tactics because it's a 4/1 and a 2/2. Inspiring Bard can pump a creature, helping you get to pack tactics. Loathsome Troll, another creature that can get you there all on its own. I've also got Ranger's Longbow here, but it's kind of a stand-in for all the red equipment too. All of it will be kind of useful for this deck. Really intent on triggering pack tactics, that's one way you can do it. You Meet in a Tavern is another one of these cards that has a mass pump effect, so it could help you trigger multiple pack tactics things at once, and presumably you're also going a little wide with things like Eltugard Ranger, and You See a Pair of Goblins, so, going to be a nice effect anyway. So what are the rares that work well here? Well, there's Zeriel, going to be good in any red deck, of course, but the +1 will work really well with pack tactics. Adding creatures to the board, like the Devil, doesn't hurt either. Minion of the Mighty is going to be almost impossible to make work in this format, but if any deck can do it, this will be it. And Werewolf Pack Leader is a nice rare who has pack tactics itself, lets you draw a card when you trigger it, and can make itself into a 5/3, getting you to pack tactics all on his own. Well, almost all on his own. So those are the 10 color pair archetypes in Adventures in Forgotten Realms Limited. And that completes this set review. I will, of course, be streaming this format and posting draft videos of it. If you're interested in seeing me draft live, you can find a link to my Twitch in the description. And videos will be starting of this new format next week. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future content, including those draft videos I mentioned, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to see the rest of this set review, where I talk about each card individually, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.